Hello, and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light on the hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Bradley Hope, and this week we're looking at a story that broke open how Vladimir Putin's regime managed to corrupt Sweden's biggest bank in order to launder cash and fund its invasion of Ukraine. I'm lucky enough to be joined by Axel Gård Humlehuer, an award-winning investigative journalist at SVT, Sweden's public broadcaster, which helped break this story. Thanks for joining us, Axel.
Thanks for having me.
So this is quite a crazy story, and I will admit that I didn't know much about it before you passed a copy of your book along. So I'm very excited to talk about this. This is the kind of thing that's happening all over the world, and it's easy to miss some things that are happening. I think especially when it comes to Russia's behavior in countries that are not as well known, like England or America. When we hear about things that Russia is up to in these other places, actually even crazier and even more important in some ways. So, but just before we get to the story of your book, could you just talk a little bit about yourself? How did you end up at SVT? What's your kind of specialty there?
I'm a reporter and producer at SVT, Swedish Public Service Television. So it's kind of like the equivalent of BBC in Sweden, and we have one big investigative format, which is called Uppdrag Granskning. In English, that would be Mission Investigate. That is airing 1 hour documentaries almost every week. So that's what I do. I do about a documentary a year, and I've been there for 15 years. And since, let's say, the year of the Panama Papers, after that, I've been involved in different kind of international cross-border projects, working on corruption, money laundering, and all the dirty stuff coming from the East, and especially Russia.
So back to Swedbank. How did this project begin? You say you do one big project per year. How did this come about, and how did you and your colleague Lars, how did you get going on this?
So I mean, the whole Swedbank saga really started by my colleague Joakim Dyvemark, who was one of the reporters on Panama Papers. He's been investigating corruption and money laundering for many years, and of all of us, of course, followed the Danske Bank scandal that evolved during 2017 and 2018. And what happened was that Danske Bank was exposed for having all these kinds of dirty money flowing through their systems in the Baltic branch, mostly Russian money. And in the end, they made an external report saying that they had some kind of suspicious funds of around 200 billion euros flowing through their branch. And everybody in the market and in Sweden started to ask questions about Swedbank, because Swedbank is the biggest bank in the Baltics, and it's the very core of the Swedish financial system. So everybody asked, like, if Danske Bank, that is a much smaller bank, is involved in this, what about Swedbank? And it was a very, very tense fall of 2018 when the Danske Bank scandal broke, and Birgitte Bonnesen, the CEO of Swedbank, she went out hard in international media and in Swedish media, saying that Swedbank has nothing to do with the Danske Bank scandal. Swedbank is a clean Swedish, non-corrupt, non-greedy, super good bank for the small people. And that was a very risky thing to do, because now 5 years later she's sentenced to jail for fraud, for about lying about was involved in this, and they had even bigger flows than Danske Bank, and that was what we revealed at SVT a couple of months later, and that's when the whole saga begun. And 5 years later, also, we came out with this book trying to put this story in the context of Russia. What was the Russian money coming from, and what was it going to? So that was the kind of long summary.
No, no, that makes sense. Obviously, the book is called The Honey Trap. When did you guys come across that part of the story, the honey trap component? And maybe you could just walk us through that the whole mechanics for which how Russia became very influential over this bank using honey traps.
Yeah, so essentially, when we broke the story of Swedbank, the CEO was fired. The whole board was swept out, and they got the former prime minister, social democratic prime minister of Sweden, Goran Persson, came in as the board of director of the board, and everybody thought that Swedbank had cleaned out and the story was over, and we was ready to move on to other stuff. And that around that time, I got a call from a source at the Swedish counter espionage department at Swedish security police. And the call was weird because it maybe should have made me freak out, because but it made me very curious, because what was said was that Russian spies have been outside your apartment trying to figure out what the hell you're doing next. And that was the start of the whole book, The Honey Trap, because I really wanted to understand, why the hell are Russian spies interested in us? What is the connection between Swedbank and the Swedbank investigation and Russian spies? Um, and that led us into a whole new chapter in this, which was the story about how Putin, the oligarchs, and FSB, the former KGB, is intertwined in these money laundering operations, and that they are using different kind of techniques for infiltration, control, information handling. And that's when we realized that even uh, prostitutes and sexual behavior of different Swedbank executive was a vital part of this kind of first pretty, paper driven, document driven story, became then a spy and sex scandal.
Well, you can't hope for a better story than that, to be honest. Well, let's just go back. We'll come back to the honey trap in a second. So let's think about Danske Bank and Swedbank. Why did Russia need to launder money in this way? Why was it sending huge amounts of money through these banks? For what purpose exactly?
The enormous amount of money flowing from Russia into the West had a few different purposes, but the most important one to talk about at the moment is the geopolitical hybrid warfare funds that have been laundered, put into the Western system, and been used for financing left and right extremist parties, influence operations against, toward Brexit, the American election, and so forth. So I think if you go back to why Danske Bank and Swedbank became so important, was that, in the around 2000, when everybody was hoping that Euro or Russia would be a European country, Putin would sit with the other big guys around the table, smiling about market economy and free speech, and Russia would be integrated into the Western economy. At that time, the Baltic states joined the EU. The Swedish banks expanded to the east and became the biggest bank in the region. And at the same time, there was a huge amount of money from these Russian oligarchs that they wanted to get into the Western system. So there was two big, wonderful demands meeting each other. The demand from the West to be in Russia, to exploit their markets, to integrate them in this economy, and then the Russian demand to gain influence, power, money into the Western system. So the Baltic states really became important in this sense because they all of a sudden they were European, they were part of EU, but they were also super corrupt because there were a former Soviet, republics, very young democracies. And so all of a sudden you had Swedish banks in EU nation with a lot of corruption. But for the Russian oligarchs and their clients, it became a super good way of getting the money into the West because all of a sudden, when you were buying real estate in London or Manhattan, when you were buying your companies or paying whatever you wanted to pay, all of a sudden you had this great stamp on your money saying this is approved by the 200-year-old Bank of Sweden. And we all know what Sweden is in the financial world, at least historically, stands for, which is everything that is good about the world, at least in theory.
So, okay, so at some point, Russian sort of intelligence operatives or whoever had this idea that we need to gain increasing sway over Swedbank, right? That's kind of how it seems to me. That's why they deployed this honey trap mechanism to start compromising officials within the bank and increasing their kind of control. Is that the right way to put it?
What we understood when we see this, in hindsight, that is that the Russian FSB has been trying to infiltrate and gain control over a lot of banks that they have been using for money laundering purpose. We have the Deutsche Bank, we have Credit Suisse, we have Swedbank and Danske Bank, and since they were throwing so much money through their systems, they really wanted insight and they wanted control. And I think some banks were easier to penetrate than others. And what we found really in the Swedbank case is like, of different reasons, we could tell the story from when this executive at Swedbank went to a Moscow hotel, drinking cocktails and hooking up with the Russian prostitutes. We've been able to track this story all the way from the beginning until the end of his career in Swedbank, when he was responsible, this banker, for the biggest oligarch accounts. And so I think, or according for example, Catherine Belton and others that have investigated these Russian schemes, they did this in a lot of banks. But what was unique with this story is that we were able to follow it very detailed from the dirty meeting in the hotel bar, and all the way to the fall of this executive in Swedbank.
And who was this executive? Like, what was his backstory? Was he a relatively clean guy who got compromised, or was he already kind of on thin ice before that already? Was he just pushed a little bit, or was he pushed a lot?
So I think it's a story that really symbolized the whole package of the West going to Russia for on this adventure in the beginning of the 2000s. So Swedbank was expanding, was opening in Moscow, in Kiev, and in the Baltics, and they needed Swedish people to go there. And in 2005, this pretty young bank executive, a middle manager at Swedbank, in the book we call him Peter, he joins the Moscow office to set up the Swedbank office there. And so at that time, he's just anybody in the banking world. But he meets then this woman, and at the famous Hotel Metropole, where KGB has been spying on Western foreigners for over 50 years. And he starts establishing a relationship with her, ending up with a marriage, ending up sending her a lot of money in Russia. And in the end, she's moving to Sweden. And by that time, he is a top executive, the third biggest, the most important executive at Swedbank, being responsible for this oligarch accounts. And so what we believe happened was that they developed this relationship over time. He didn't know that she was connected to FSB, and they realized over the relationship how important he was. So when he was sitting on the top of Swedbank, and when they were having all these billions flowing from these oligarchs, they had a direct channel through this woman into the top branch of Swedbank. So it was a penetration that was extremely successful.
And as far as you can tell, how did they use what they had on him? I mean, were they themselves meeting him, threatening to expose things, or was it more subtle because they had this sort of backdoor into him through his wife at the time?
The reason for us that we even know this is that when we started digging about the Russian spies involving in the money laundering, we got access to a leaked dossier from Russia about Swedbank. And we believe that, you know, because of the crisis in Russia, there has been a lot of dropouts with Russian spies going over to the West. And we believe that this dossier was taken as part of a dropout. So we got access into looking what did the FSB have, what kind of material did they have on these Swedbank's executive, and we found that they had not only on Peter but on several top executives. They had sexual relationship, drug abuse, different kind of kompromat that could be very, very damaging. And this, we don't know exactly how this was used. And we know that they gained insight into the heart of Swedbank. They had emails from top executives. They had account information. Um, but we don't know how it was actually used. And one theory is that, you know, 2011 was a very important year for Swedbank because that's when they had the chance of kicking some of these oligarchs out, and instead they increased their limit of how much business they could do in the bank. And at that time, this Peter was that was his final decision was on his table. So one theory is that, you know, as with the discussion about Donald Trump and kompromat of Russia, is that kompromat is most useful when the other part knows that the enemy has something. You don't know exactly what they have, but you know that they have something very damaging on you. And you know that if you would take a decision that goes against your enemy's interest, this will haunt you. Um, and I think that's why this honey trap technique that we can talk more about has been so successful for the Russians during the years, because kompromat is as best used when not made public, because as long as it's not public, you can really affect people. And that's why these Russian women that are educated of seducing men are a super good weapon in the geopolitical warfare of Russia, because they can essentially destroy the lives and careers of these men, and therefore they have influence over them.
Mm. And whatever happened to that woman, the wife of this person you're calling Peter? Do you know what happened to her? Did she leave the country? Did she go back to Russia?
When we discovered this story, we started tracking her, of course, and it was a very interesting journey because, first of all, we realized that she had a son that was also Russian and that was working on a Swedish authority with a security clearance. Uh, and that was very, of course, a red flag for Swedish security police. And then in the end, we found her in a suburb of Stockholm, and I met her. We were sitting outside, spying on her apartment or her, and all of a sudden she walked out to her car, and I came up to her, introduced myself, and she said the famous words, "I've been waiting for somebody to find me." Uh, and I realized that she had been waiting to for this secret to unfold, and we decided to meet later on that day, which was one of the biggest mistake that I let her go, because we set up a meeting and she never showed up, and then she disappeared again.
This is one of the great phrases of journalism. I've been waiting for you to call. It's usually a good sign, but it can always fall through your fingers as well.
Never let a meeting slip out of your hands is also
Yeah,
good.
exactly.
But I was I was too polite and said, "Yeah, let's meet when you calm down." And then she just ran away.
It happens. Earlier, you spoke about the CEO of the bank making these comments that we're not like Danske Bank, nothing similar here. Why was the CEO saying that? Were they also compromised in this in some way, or what was the motivation to try to conceal all of this at that top level? This is a major Swedish bank. There maybe not every single person there is compromised, right? Is it the money that they were making from it?
So this is a very interesting part of this story, because it's now been in two levels of court. First, the lower courts, then the higher court, and now she's sentenced to more than a year in prison for fraud, about lying about the money laundering. And what everybody's asking is, of course, why did she do this? Why did she risk her whole life and her career for this lie? And there are several answers on it. I think in the book we're writing that a lot of the Swedbank CEO executives, they knew that Russians were on them. They knew that they were being spied upon. And this woman, Birgitte Bonnesen, she used to joke to some of her colleagues that, I feel bad for the Russian spies that have to follow me around because I have such a boring life. I'm a teenage mother just working all the time. And in comparison to some of the male executives that, they were talking about Swedish banking and feminist banking, which is, everybody is equal, and we're going to have this Swedish way of doing business. They were talking about that during the daytime, and then at nighttime they went to brothels and strip clubs in the Baltics. But Birgitte Bonnesen, she was not compromised in any way that we know. But what she saw was that Danske Bank was falling apart over this scandal. The stock plummeted down, billions were lost, because this was, after the invasion of Crimea, it was a lot of talk about Russia and dirty money. So she understood that if Swedbank is involved in this, it's going to mean huge losses for the bank. And so we believe she didn't do it for her own gain, but she did it to prep up the stock value of the bank, and that's what
Mm,
she is sentenced for in the end. And when our program aired, they lost about $10 billion in stock value. And so that really showed that this was, her concern was pretty obvious, that
yeah.
she didn't want to be dragged into this.
And has anybody else gone to prison?
No, except for one of the most famous oligarchs in Swedbank. He is in prison in Russia after a corruption case there, which is very political, of course. But none other have been sentenced or been charged. And I think that is one of the tragedies of these money laundering operations, that the money is so big, the use of the money is for such important, anti-democratic behavior, and there are so few that have been punished for making it possible.
What has been the fallout in Sweden over this scandal? I mean, of course, whenever there's a scandal, everyone says, "Never again. We won't have this happen." But I mean, is there some sense you have that the Swedish banking sector has really had a wake up call and is going to be better protected about this in the future?
The big wake-up call for the Swedish population about Russia was the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and understanding that the war is getting closer to our borders, and we need to wake up. And what we have been trying to do with the book and with the Swedbank story is to connect the war to the money laundering, because Swedbank and some other banks was vital in the preparation for the war for Putin. One of the clients of Swedbank was Viktor Yanukovych, the corrupt ousted president in 2014. Another person that received money through Swedbank was Paul Manafort, that really made a lot of damage in both the US and Ukraine. And some of the Russian oligarchs that laundered money through Swedbank was also vital for infrastructure, weapon industry, military industry, and so forth. And I think we succeeded in this, making it, it's been a bestseller in Sweden, and really connecting these two worlds of how money is not about money, it's about power, it's about war, it's about how Putin is trying to rebuild the Russian Empire. And Swedbank has been a part of that scheme, and I think that nobody thought that would be a story 20 years ago, that this wonderful kind of idea of the bank for the the working class and everything would be expanded and being a bank for the working oligarchs. The fascinating thing with the money that went to Swedbank was, the top client that Swedbank had was a oligarch named Iskander Mahmudov, and he became famous in the 90s together with Oleg Deripaska and some of the other oligarchs, part of the so-called aluminum wars in Russia during the 90s, where there's a lot of people killed over control over the mining industry and the natural resources. And at the same hotel that the Swedbank executive Peter met the Russian prostitute and the FSB connected woman, 10 years earlier, this Hotel Metropole in the East, wild East after Soviet fall, there was a famous meeting in the restaurant there with this Russian oligarch. And he was, one of his business partner was a famous mafia guy that later fell out of an airplane in South Africa mysteriously. And they had a kind of a symbolic meeting for the Russian economy in the 90s. There was a guy, they wanted to take over the control of his mine, and he said, no, I would like to keep my mine. And then the security personnel for this specific Swedbank oligarch just called in his guys with a lot of weapons, saying that, you better turn this mine over in our control or we'll kill you. And that was in the same hotel. And 10 years later, the Swedbank executive were in that bar, and Swedbank's biggest high-risk non-resident client was this Russian oligarch, and funneling his dirty money into the West. So this was not like, criminal money by proxy. This was mafia money gained control by guns and bombs that was sent to these Western institutions. And therefore, it is amazing that it was not stopped. It was that it could go through so much is almost hard to grasp.
It's very fascinating. I guess my big question for you, though, is when you found out that there was Russian spies outside your house surveilling you, what was your response? Did you go knock on the window? Did you feel scared? Did you feel excited? Did you feel thrilled?
Most normal, healthy people would get scared and maybe change apartment and never ever investigate this kind of topic again. But I was I was pretty read up on the Russian security service, and I knew that they wouldn't, hurt me or my kids. Um, it would be very, very, very irrational and non-compliant with their history. They kill Russian traders, but they very seldom go hard on Western journalists. And so I felt pretty safe. And the big thing that I became was curious. I wanted to understand, what was the reason for us? We're a small country in the northern Europe. Why are FSB interested in what we're doing? And the answer on that was so fascinating, because in the end, we realized that Swedbank was a great tool of the hybrid warfare. And, if Londongrad or London LLPs and London, institution was a vital part for the Russian influence campaigns over the years, Sweden and Swedbank was part of that, a link in that chain. And that surprised me, and it surprised a lot of people, and it really woke up many people in the banking world. And your question was, after this long answer, did Sweden change or Swedbank change? And I think now Swedbank really invested in AML, anti-money laundering programs. They have really hired a lot of good people. They are taking it seriously, and we've seen great improvements. But one can argue also that it was too late, because now we have the war, and Europe is really polarized and in a bad shape due to some of this money that was flowing.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm sure this particular story will keep you, will stay on your radar for years to come, because things still coming out about it. And of course, all of us look forward to seeing what else you guys come up with at SVT. Obviously doing great work over there. So thank you for joining us and telling us all about it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us, Axel. We're excited to see this crazy story reach a wider audience. For our Swedish-speaking listeners, Axel's book, The Honey Trap, is out now. And you can follow Axel on Twitter at AXELHUMLESJO for updates on the story. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week for more.
Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean, Claire Urban, and Arnav Binaikia. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, and Charlie Barlow is associate producer. Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.